Welcome to another episode of Doubl3Tap. Today we are joined by John Hook, co-founder of PlayEmber. John, how are you doing, man?
I'm good, guys. Excited to be here. I'm looking forward to some hard-hitting questions. No speculation, just pure facts. So I'm excited to be here.
That's right. Well, having said that, before we get right into it, like quick disclaimer, the contents of this video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is not financial advice. That said, the opinions Alex and I share are our own, and we may have investments in some of the projects or assets spoken about during the show. So, with that out of the way, John, what are you currently playing at the moment?
What game am I currently playing?
Yeah,
I'm going to give you two. So like Mario Kart, it just never gets old. Like I
classic.
just love it for just pure escape. You know, the same just dopamine hit every time. I just love it, and just the really geeky like cosmetic stuff. Just like trying to find like that perfect looking little setup with like the wheels, the chassis, and every drop Nintendo do, it just gets better. The second one is like, I'm a massive sports fan, so just like football management games. It's pretty dry, but I just love it. Just get really deep into it. Um, so yeah, those are my two games. They don't mix at all.
What, what
Until someone does like a Mario Kart like F1 management simulation, right?
Mario Kart Simulator? Maybe that's the next on-chain game. Is that maybe what's
Yeah,
next to come for PlayEmber?
yeah. Well, no, maybe the guys at Oh Baby. I mean, I reckon they could do it, right? They
Yeah,
they
true.
they'd crush
There's
that.
already their foundation is pretty solid already.
Yeah,
Do you
yeah.
play like Evo, Pro Evo, or
No, I'm not. I'm not. I kind of eat what I make, if that makes sense. Like, um, that's why I love it as well. Watch too much time on just stupid like pop culture stuff that heavily influences like themes in our games as well. Um, Spent unhealthy time on like social media channels as well. So yeah, very much like a bit more with hybrid now. Maybe not much of an RPG guy, but play a few more hybrid games. But yeah, much more like hybrid casual, or yeah, just very much a Nintendo child basically.
All right, so John, recently you've been posting a lot about unique active wallets, posting kind of the link from Radar, and talking a lot about a lot of the new entrants, new users to PlayEmber. So curious if you could talk a little bit about one of the core levers, or maybe a couple of the different levers that you guys were playing around with to get to that point, and if you could talk a little bit about what you think might have led to the significant increase recently.
Yeah, for sure. It's really topical because when you say unique active wallets, all I can see is Gabe's post now on Twitter of those bot farms. So that's in my mind. So my disclaimer to that is that does make me laugh. And if you were a pure Web3 game, I kind of think maybe that's true. But the way I try and explain it is even before we get to like a unique active wallet, there's like $1 billion Web2 ad stack that users have got to get through and verify even before they can create a wallet. So, all the Google technology that we use, we partner with AppsFlyer in terms of like Web2 attribution as well to correctly not just verify, but attribute the source of the install as well. Um, but yeah, anyway, that made me laugh when I saw that. But I think for us, where the users are coming from is relatively simple. So we're still in private beta on our own users and our own games. So we have 5 million daily active users in our Web2 games across iOS and Android. And we've got, the important thing is, they're not bots, they're real people playing and enjoying our games, but we have all of that historic Web2 data as well, right? And what it's what our thesis is how can blockchain technology make gameplay more exciting? And if we get players playing for longer, of course, retention goes up. And by default, given how those games are monetized, they will then be consuming more ads and also putting more money in through in-app purchases. And we also have a lot of the creative user acquisition learnings in terms of, it varies by game, but the like best performing creative and what that hooking is. So that was our starting point for this project, which is, okay, if we're going to onboard the next billion into Web3, let's start with a small number. We've done over 1 million so far, so it's not a bad start. But if we're going to, play our part towards that number, how do we actually start moving these users over into Web3, and what are those motivations and hooks? So before we even touched our games and the SDK, we started with the basics, which is actually building ad creatives and just playing around with different messaging to see what the kind of click-through rate was and what those hooks were. So no surprises with the Web2 audiences, and obviously caveat from my side is that what I'm saying really does vary by country and by ad network based on the rules of what you can and can't put in an ad creative. So let's just park that, because that would be a bit of a boring podcast. But what we saw very high level is probably what hopefully is common sense, right? And for me, that's great news, right? So anything that you mention a token, you saw really poor conversion rates, right? I can't tell you exactly why, but logic would dictate, okay, stop. I'm not necessarily interested in a token. I want to play a game. Any hook that was around something that Web2 people understand. So it could be PayPal gift cards, right? It could be like gift cards or prizes or competitions. Varying levels of success depending on the country, but overall a stronger cohort of people that were saying, hey, I'm interested, I'll come and have a look, versus anything that was about a token or an NFT. Again, no surprises if we park NFT and what Web2 know how to do, which is, everyone loves strong IP, right? That's always interesting, very subjective, but people like IP. And they love collecting stuff. So again, sort of playing around with combinations of that. Also saw a stronger performance than anything in terms of NFT. So that's really where we started to build on. The next point was then really obsessing over the UI UX, or FTUE, so first time user experience, in terms of then people coming in and creating a wallet. So we don't talk about wallets internally. Yes, I post about it, but internally that word is banned. We talk about players and accounts.
So it sounds like you're constantly running different hypotheses, and then you're kind of going out, kind of collecting that data and then using it in this tight feedback loop, excuse me, to basically figure out, okay, what's kind of the next hypothesis that we're going to test. You also mentioned that a lot of times these hypotheses that you're testing, the answer is the logical one. I'm curious, were there any like illogical sort of responses or types of feedback, or anything that was, maybe a little bit out of left field or totally unexpected that came back as a result of one of these, many hypotheses you guys have been testing over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I think that's the great thing about our game genre, is that we can test hypotheses relatively quickly without having to spend 12 months in development, maybe like 3-6 years for like AAA games. So that's one advantage our genre has. I guess in terms of surprising, there's two things that jump out. So Jack and I have been talking a lot about kind of play to earn games and these Bitcoin games specifically. So quick context on that to explain why this finding was interesting. So we've got these mass Web2 players who are not crypto natives, and their motivation clearly is coming to play game and have fun. There's no earning in their mind at the moment in our ecosystem. But we really wanted to get exposure to what we call the crypto curious. So maybe people that have made that decision already, that I like the idea of Web3 gaming, or I'm interested in crypto in some shape or form. What is the gaming experience for me? So we deployed 5 games on the Lightning network in partnership with Zebedee. Again, very hyper casual in nature, but you can play the games and in return earn like micro amounts of Bitcoin. And set up a brand new Discord for this, because we really wanted to get that feedback loop from players that we don't get at the moment from those sort of top of funnel Web2 players. And what wasn't interesting was what was confirmed initially was effectively we'll play almost any game so long as they get that reward. And then it gets to a layer down, like for us now, we've got 5 games. Quickly saw them trying to figure out if there is a game that gave them the same earnings but quicker than another game, because it's all about, the value for them is their time. the most surprising thing is getting through that. And, again, this is why it's great to test everything, is that they actually care about games. So once you get through that barrier and they've got that value exchange, was what I wasn't expecting, rightly or wrongly, was like, hey, very now active and constructive in providing feedback on these games and other mechanics that they actually wanted to see. And probably being a developer at heart, the most exciting thing out of some of those wasn't even about earning. For me, the danger then on those data signals is what people lean into is the golden cohort. And I think that's why it's interesting for us, because obviously the more people get invested and there is that incentive, even on a decent cohort size, you need to test that same thesis perhaps on a larger audience who aren't as invested in the game, that could still have that same motivation, depending on how your game is financialized, to really confirm that broader game thesis.
It sounds like you get to a point where you have this initial cohort that comes in that might be a little bit more financially motivated, and then you get feedback from them after you kind of get over this initial hurdle of, oh, now they actually kind of, or maybe they're enjoying the game a little bit more than they initially thought. They were initially brought in by the financial kind of incentives. Now they're here, they're providing feedback. Is that feedback that you're A/B testing? So in other words, have you guys already gone through the process of, hey, here's the feedback that we've gotten from these early people that are essentially helping us QA. Now we're going to go test out their feedback in one iteration or permutation of the product or the core loop. And then we've also tested, on a different audience, what that game would have looked like if we didn't implement the feedback that we got from the financially motivated players. And I'm curious, have you guys run those tests? If you have, I'm curious what the feedback's been. If you haven't, is that something that you would consider doing, or why am I thinking about that maybe incorrectly?
Yeah, no, 100%. Like every single part of our business is an A/B test, is an experiment, right? From our ad creatives to our approach to user acquisition, the networks that we use, to our game development and testing. And that's why kind of leaning into Web3 is just really exciting. So to my previous point, let's take this crypto curious audience. When we see something that's really exciting to them, and that they've helped almost like co-design, and we get confirmation there, what we're looking to do is then immediately test that on this Web2 native audience. And we can do that two ways in A/B test. We can just test the pure game mechanic, and we can then, the A/B would be the game mechanic with the more Web2 reward in it as the motivation, versus effectively the same mechanic with the same reward that the crypto curious are enjoying, and see which one performs better. But I think, in our game, that's what we're looking for, is quick confirmation that these A/B tests can work at a fairly large level across, multiple countries, and ideally in the same genre. So yeah, we're performing A/B tests, but pretty much everything we do is just one giant test. And if it doesn't work, we just test again in a different way.
So I'm curious, where you've mentioned a lot about the A/B testing, and a lot of that has to do with the UA and the different creatives you're using and what resonates, what works, what doesn't work. And we've previously spoken about like Web3 incentives, that role within like retention and boosting retention. Throughout the process, you've obviously got to a point now. I just had a quick check, and at like Doubl3Tap's quoting you at having like above 1 million monthly active wallets. Like, God knows how many of those are real users, but regardless, it's above average, at least for this space, right? What has there been any tests, or are you now sort of starting to shift focus a little more onto activations and like getting people to convert into paying users? And how is that going? Is it more still just like a Web2 problem, or are you starting to experiment and seen any positive results with Web3 mechanisms and how they play a role in that conversion?
So I think there's two parts to that question that are important. The first one is how we need to start thinking about Web3 metrics and what are important versus Web2. So the Web2 business model is built on, DAU. You hear that a lot, and that is important, particularly on, again, the genre of game. Versus when you start thinking about, like Web3 and the kind of metrics that are important, I think, UAW is great. As I started off earlier, I'd like to think a large percentage of our UAWs are actually real because of the process they have to go through to even open a wallet. But there's no doubt in terms of Web3 gaming that it's more about like transaction volumes, right? That's if you really think about what a lot of the sort of like investors, analysts, and as you start thinking about some form of token along the way, what the exchanges and that ecosystem are looking for. So I think that's the first point. We're not looking for like a one-to-one swap from what we see in Web2 to Web3. And I think with this new crypto curious audience, what we're also seeing is different motivations that currently don't exist from Web2. So at the moment, I think we are trying to create this funnel, and what we can't control is the speed at which people move through that funnel, just like we can't in Web2. But what we can influence and gamify is pretty much the entire process from the moment you're onboarded to provide you with a fun range of options that could accelerate your game experience and progress. It's just accepting that that's going to look very different to at a simple level. That if we A/B test everything, the most simplest analogy is going to be those people that are motivated by coming to have fun, and that's their primary motivation. If as a result of that they discover this additional open marketplace that gives them some side return for their time, that's just a bonus to them. But for us, what we hope it will result in is more like retention within this ecosystem and a reason for them to stick around, unlike the sort of Web2 business models we're looking to disrupt. Versus Web3, I don't think there's it getting any away from that mentality from what we've seen. And we all know that if you're in Web3 gaming, I'd like to think that the quality of the game does and should matter. But there is also a school of thought that maybe you can get away with a lower standard of game versus your Web2 counterpart if that's outweighed by the financial incentive for participating in that game. So I think the early signs that we are starting to see is there is definitely that funnel and that process from our Web2 players. We're going to see in this next phase how quickly that's accelerated once we start introducing this concept of an open marketplace and digital collectibles that actually could have some extra value. I think the good thing that we're seeing is hyper-casual less so, because you tend to get lower percentage of IEPs in there. Generally, I think the industry quota figure is around 1%. Versus when you start looking at, let's say, hybrid games, fastest growing segment in terms of downloads at the moment. Idle games, certainly when you get to casual games, you could be up to 30 to 40% of your revenue as in-app purchases. So that's got us experimenting a lot at the moment, a lot of thinking for this next phase of growth about where our, let's say, Web2 free-to-play focus is. Because again, the less you've got to teach people new behaviors, the faster you can move. So clearly, when we think about putting money in, based on what I've just said, then casual gaming is just a rich territory because that behavior is already there, right? They already will put money in to accelerate. It's just hopefully going to be a new excitement that, holy shit, I actually can get money out now, right? In some shape or form. Or the way we like to talk about it is I'm getting some extra benefit or some extra boost or buff or accelerant for all that money that I've put in, and or holy shit, all of that investment, in game A is now, is now in game B. So if you think about, imagine if King, for example, in their Candy Crush saga or their Bubble Witch saga had this kind of thinking, and all the time you put into the, Candy Crush, that you could move into, another casual game in King's ecosystem. It'd be pretty cool from a player perspective, and for those people that have put, billions of dollars into that ecosystem.
I want to switch gears a little bit, and we lightly touched on it a bit earlier in how you've been doing a lot of testing with Bitcoin gaming and the Lightning Network, and how this concept of nanotransactions has been able to increase retention, etc. I'm curious, like, how you evaluate Bitcoin rewards, which are widely viewed as like a more cemented sort of store of value, exchange of value, a little bit easier for like normies to accept. How you evaluate Bitcoin rewards as a sustainable retention mechanic next to, say, a native token incentive that a lot of other projects are using at the moment?
Your questions are really hard because there's never like, well, there's like 8 parts to that question. So there's there's like because part of that is implicit, is a subjective opinion based on, you know, a player's view of that token that's therefore got nothing to the game as like an acquisition hook, right? Because it's not for us to judge whether Bitcoin is a, you know, more perceived stable, you know, like reward for a game versus Ethereum versus, you know, Solana or any other token. We'll let players decide that in terms of what they want to come in. I think the point on sustainability also for me could be linked. So based on the testing, I think if you did a lot of testing and you've got that data to show that, okay, Bitcoin rewards have a higher draw than another native token, then I think that's the next part. But in terms of sustainability, that part is on you as a game developer. So in our economy, the sustainability initially has been on advertising. So the ECPM of, or the value of that ad unit that player is consuming. And that, again, is not fixed. You have the variable of the country that you're in. You have the variable of the game genre that you're in. So ECPMs in sort of like hypercasual, idle, hybrid, merge, casual starts to go up and up. And then obviously the amount you consume, because you get that sort of ECPM curve. It's not like it just keeps stacking. So if I've watched 25 rewarded videos, it just, the value of each time I watch one goes up and up. You kind of hit a wall that, again, will vary by game. But let's say, for argument's sake, once you've watched 7, 8 rewarded videos, you've kind of hit that wall and it declines. So the sustainability of that is not a, you know, one size fits all question, because you've got all those variables in there. But I think in the short term, it's the fairest way in a Web 2 context to reward a player for their time, because it's dynamically linked in real time to the contribution you put in and redistributing that to the player, which for me feels a bit more comfortable than the pure like one-to-one reward like you see sometimes in Web3 gaming, because I think that's been proven already as not the most sustainable way. But I think then where we need to get to, which is another part of your question, which is the nano transaction piece, that is the bit that we need to solve, because for me, that's the most interesting thing when you talk about Bitcoin, because the problem there is not a gaming problem. It's a fintech wallet problem. It's an accessibility problem. And that's what we've seen in Web 2. We have millions of players in countries that Web 2 makes it very hard to get a bank account, so they can't even put money into a game because they can't get a bank account. Whereas in Web 3, if you can give someone access to a wallet and you level the playing field across all countries, so anyone can come in and play a game and put money in if you make it enjoyable enough and make it easy, I think that's the piece where, you know, sustainability will go up a level, where you're not only reliant on ads and, you know, Web 2 IP that, you know, again, in the games we're playing in is no small amount, right? It's not trivial. But if we can now start unlocking the, you know, let's call it the locked or the missed potential in Web 2 of these millions of players in, you know, countries like the Philippines that have just fully embraced Web 3 and arguably leading the space, or, you know, in Brazil or Africa, if we can enable them to contribute to the games the way they already are doing in Web3 gaming, but they can't in Web 2, and deliver this system that enables them to, you know, put money in through micro transactions to then stack on top of the ad and in-app purchase revenue that we already have coming from Web 2, that starts to get very interesting from ecosystem. And I think that is the path to, you know, sustainability moving forward for Web3 experiences.
You brought up some really interesting points, and I think they're valid for a lot of game designers, even outside of hyper casual or hybrid casual. The one point I'm still kind of curious to hear your take on is that speculative element. So as opposed to giving like a players an opportunity to earn gift cards on blockchain rails, as opposed to, you know, that feeling of having aligned incentives with the success of the project via like a more dynamically priced token.
So I think speculation in its own right is a game. Like that is, you could argue that is the game in terms of Web3. When people start talking about NFTs, like that's a game in itself. It's a collection game. It's a speculation game again about which NFT or brand is going to have the most success, whether that's short, medium, long term. So I think that the way that Web3 gaming is going, that's definitely the biggest challenge, right? And that's why we're here, because we love challenges. I was going to say how on earth, because it makes it's very British of me, but also sounds very impossible. But like how on earth do you balance Web2 that is a completely controlled economy, right, with the variables we've just discussed around ad revenue, but effectively like you control that entire locked economy, versus the whole concept, to your point, Jackal, of Web3 is around player owned and player created economies, right? So how on earth do you fit those two worlds together that on paper have very different like views and motivation? So I think some thoughts on that in terms of how we're approaching it, which is, well, this category over here in Web3 are the early adopters, right? They've got the right idea. They want to contribute. It's just at the moment, perhaps there aren't the ecosystems or the games in this casual space that are allowing them to do that. And this is then where your sustainability question comes in. So I think trying to just accept that these players are further ahead. They have the behavior they want, and therefore you can build your ecosystem around them, because they can teach everyone coming in. So let's give a couple of examples of that. So they're already there. They understand how to use this Web3 technology, and they understand how to use the game. And when you start trying to create an open marketplace, one of the things you need to stimulate an open marketplace, you need people, creating, designing, distributing, purchasing assets. So that's what this existing Web3 crowd can help do, because if they're in there early and creating that base layer, then as slowly we start converting and teaching these Web2 players from mobile games that there are digital items that they have won in this game, and oh, by the way, this item that you've just won, someone has just put a bid in on it. Well, that's fascinating, because immediately that's the quickest way you can teach someone a new behavior about an open marketplace. Not click here, jump out, go to another website. As soon as you get something, then you've got a bid on it. That's fascinating, and then that's coming from this active player base here, are already into the game and know exactly which item or which boost, whatever it is they want. They're then fueling that sort of like next wave of players coming in and sort of teaching them. So and then being rewarded in their own right for being there early in the game, because the general expectation is if you're early, then you're getting early access to not just alpha of a game, but some maybe of the early assets, because you're there before other players.
So, John, a lot of times you're grounding these answers in specific genres that you guys are spending a lot of time on, right? Like hyper casual, casual. I'm curious, like in kind of bridging those two worlds, as you've been talking about between Web 2 and Web 3, what do you think some of the biggest issues are with attacking kind of the hyper casual genre? Because I would say, in my opinion, over the last year or so, a lot of people have been kind of attacking hyper casual and said, hey, these are players that historically are just monetized through ads. They don't really have super high LTVs. So maybe if you're having a smaller user base or lower DAUs, right, as you said, Web 2 metric, maybe these are players that maybe are not ripe for Web 3. And because of that, maybe you should be looking at a different type of genre. Just trying to kind of air or float some of the criticisms of hyper casual. So given that you spent so much time on it, I'm curious, how is that thinking maybe wrong, or how are you thinking about that differently? In really
I mean, look, I've been used to it for years. People shitting all over hyper casual, right? And it's look, I get it. It's not everyone's type of game. Some people argue it's just not a game. It's just a pure financial balance of cost per install versus LTV. They're just basically a bit of content with ads in it. But as I said earlier, the bottom line is it's a like $11-12 billion genre in Web 2 that plays an important part for moving players around this ecosystem. So, case in point, when you look at like the M&A activity, why did Zynga buy Rollic? Just as one example. Rollic, phenomenal company, great CEO, but I would argue they bought Rollic for two reasons. One, because of the changing landscape, and they obviously what everyone knew was coming with Apple and ATT and privacy. Well, one, a defensive maneuver to acquire millions of players and first party data, but two, probably someone at Zynga did some very smart maths and was like, okay, well, we think we're going to get a much more cost effective ROI on this investment. An ability and a nice fit, to my point around moving these players from hyper casual games to our nice casual, match 3 games, versus deploying those same ad dollars directly on Facebook. Likewise, that's not like a one-off example. If you look at, when Tencent invested in Voodoo at $1 billion valuation, the majority of their revenue and EBITDA was from, hyper casual games. Iron Source with their publishing division Supersonic listed on the NASDAQ, then acquired by Unity. Large majority of what Supersonic were doing was hyper casual. So I think the hyper casual business model is definitely having some challenges, but then the second half of your question is where Web3 comes in, because all of these companies that have got contributing to this $12 billion segment, they've all got the same problem that they've been scrambling to figure out the problem to, hence why they're wheeling out the narrative conveniently for them that hyper casual is dead. It's not dead. Their revenues are still healthy. It's just EBITDA is declining. Players are still downloading these games. I think it was like 2-3 billion downloads in the last quarter. The problems are this. One, how do you get these players to stay in the same ecosystem? Because they're playing a Voodoo game and then they see an ad, and then they're playing an Oma game and then they see another ad, and then now they're in Zynga's ecosystem. So that's actually the problem, which is you might have got a nice acquisition cost, but your LTV sucks because you've got no reason for them to stay in your ecosystem. Of course, you try through cross promo, but you're basically biting off the hands that feed you, because you would have to take out mediation and all the ad networks. So that is a fundamental problem where Web3 comes in, because, okay, how can you incentivize people to stay into an ecosystem? And it's not just about the incentive, it's about the transferability of assets and value as well. Those two things for me are intrinsically linked. So I think those are two key things that can help solve this problem. I think the other, again, it's not this new element, but combined to 1 and 2, when you start combining a social UGC layer to those points 1 and 2, this starts to get very, very interesting, because hyper casual games inherently are single player or single player versus AI. So those are, I think, the areas that when you start getting that firing all together, starts to get very, very interesting, because you've then immediately solved a massive challenge in terms of Web 2, keeping people within that same ecosystem. And then by default, as you start enabling them to play for longer, a lot of the things that we've walked through already start to tick in here in terms of, increased monetizations, microtransactions, and then that network effect in terms of, you do get organics in Web 2, but when you spent a lot of money on basically flying up the charts, that's generally when you see organics. You don't generally see a lot. Like, we have Web 2 KOLs even last week sharing our games on YouTube with like 1 million views, but we don't see that direct correlation in terms of organics. I believe when you go through this sort of approach that we're starting to go through, that you should start to see unlocking of like meaningful organic, like, user acquisition for this hyper casual genre.
And there we have it. John, it's been a pleasure, sir. Thank you very much.
No, thanks, guys. I appreciate you having me on. It's late for you, Jackal, early for you, Alex. So yeah, appreciate it as always.
Pleasure. Till next time. The content of this video is intended for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. The views shared by Alex and I are our own, and we may hold investments in some of the companies or digital assets featured in the video.